started. So hello and a very warm welcome to this event where we will be seeking to solve education's biggest challenges. So I'm Sarah, I'm co-founder and research director for Cosmos, and I will be your host for today. So just a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. So we'll see how much time we've got at the end for questions, and we'll kind of play that a little bit by ear, but please do get involved in the chat. I'll be in the chat, and what I'll do at the end as well is pick up maybe some themes and comments for Damien to pick up on at the end, just depending on how we're running for time. And also please don't forget that we'll be inviting everybody to a roundtable after the event for a much smaller and more focused group where you'll have the chance to just explore some collaborative approaches, continue the conversation, dig a little bit deeper as well with like-minded peers. So we've got a really great session lined up today. So really just expect to be enlightened, informed and motivated for this next hour. And solving these perennial challenges in education is something that is really very close to our hearts here at Cosmos. So just a little bit about Cosmos for those who aren't familiar with our work. We work in the education sector and we improve outcomes for disadvantaged students. So our insights really drive kind of clear direction on what will and won't drive those improved outcomes. And alongside this, we also develop tools for educators who really want to deliver programs that really connect with those hard to reach students and also have a measurable impact on their outcomes. So I'd say we're probably best known for our work with underrepresented students. We've conducted research now, I'd say, with over 100,000 disadvantaged students, and this makes us sound really old, but across the team, we've got over 3 decades of experience of working on the ground with those that are really hardest to reach. And on challenges in education, I would say that for us, the main challenges that we've seen within the sector, and particularly access and participation, is time and lack thereof, which I know that will resonate with probably most of you. So I think developing and testing programs and initiatives for these student groups, disadvantaged students, is incredibly time consuming, and efforts can also sometimes feel wasted when agendas at the top change, which they often do. So what we've seen is sometimes this hesitancy around really investing in those larger and more sustained programs for these students, and shrinking budgets and wider remits. So again, I know that's something that will probably resonate with most. And what this really does do is leads to really difficult decisions and also quite a bit of guilt actually around missing out on those certain target groups and subgroups of students that actually do really need the help and support. And not knowing for certain which programs will resonate with students and lead to those improved outcomes. So as we know, students are not a homogenous group, particularly underrepresented students as well. There's lots of different subgroups within that, and it's really hard to know for certain which programs are going to kind of resonate with those subgroups. And I think that's really due to a limited evidence base so far that we've got. So I've just thrown quite a lot of challenges out there. So I think, maybe the big question is, how do you create the perfect access program for disadvantaged students? And I think over the years, what we've seen is what does and doesn't work when developing access programs. So what we did was we did a little exercise. So we decided to kind of pull all of those insights together and develop something that we've called the Student Outcomes Blueprint. And this has 5 key principles for program development with disadvantaged students. So that's when you're developing programs for those students in particular. What does and doesn't work, what is going to move the needle, and what we've seen as evidence really when working with our clients and partners. So when followed, what we did see, there was a lot of time saved across the team. Generally, developing programs was much easier. Managers could just spend more time planning, strategizing, and the team could, more importantly, spend more time delivering to those students. We also saw improved strike rate of successful programs being delivered, and higher engagement in the program content as well from the students, and that consistent improvement in those student outcomes. So these principles sound magic, but when put together, what we've seen as evidence is that they really do, like I say, help to move the needle. So we will be sharing that as a resource after this event, as a free resource after the event. So please do look out for that. And I think ultimately we at Cosmos do believe that a student's potential shouldn't be limited by their postcode, as we were and we are the young people that we work with, which is why we're so kind of passionate about this. So now to move on and to introduce our speaker, Damien Page, who is the incoming Vice-Chancellor of Buckinghamshire New University. And he brings such a wealth of experience in educational leadership, 2 decades plus, and a real strong commitment to driving that positive change in this area. And Damian is really known for his progressive approach in this space. And I know that just personally from knowing him over the years. And he's really championed access and diversity and inclusion throughout his career, and has also influenced lots of policies and practices that improve outcomes for all students. And his work really emphasises a collaborative and forward-thinking vision for higher education, which both empowers the students and the educators to reach their full potential. And I think if you follow Damien on LinkedIn or Twitter, I think you'll know this to be true. And if you don't, I would definitely encourage you to do so. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Damien. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that was the best introduction I've ever had. That's going to have to become the standard now whenever I do one.
Oh, is it? Okay, raising the bar. I'll take that.
Copyright. Yeah, great to be here. And again, over the 10 years ago we worked together, so
yes,
it's good that we've kept these kind of connections, and I always find them really valuable. So I was the first in my family to enter university. I was what would now be called a disadvantaged student, and back then I don't ever remember the term being used. I don't remember a focus about disadvantage. There was certainly no breakdown of achievement or access by postcode. If there had been, then I'd have been in the area of social deprivation as it's measured in various ways now. So most of my family come a very traditional white working class area. Most of my family didn't stay on past 16. I was the first one who didn't stay in education past 16. So the traditional route for my area and my family was manual labour. It didn't work for me. The idea of doing that, it was kind of inevitable. But we had the 11+ system down there, which is kind of ironic since I'm a great critic of the 11+ and the selective education and the grammar school system. But I passed the 11+ and went to grammar school. And there you really started to see, it was part grammar, part comprehensive. And the difference, you could see the inequalities right there in the same buildings. There was however many, 2,000 students. If you passed the 11+, there was 3 groups of us. So we were the alphas. So it was 1 alpha, whatever. And the students who hadn't passed 11+ were the A band. And the kind of hierarchy that created, and I never thought about it at the time. It's only many years later when you start to see how education structures inequalities at an early age and how they continue through university and then through into graduate employment. So when I got to university, it never felt as though it wasn't for people like me. I went in there, I hadn't been prepared. It was the grammar school system was just that you're going to go to university. So it was all about completing the UCAS form, finding the course, etc. What I never received was any preparation for what the experience of being at university was like. I did English and American literature, and that's about the most middle class degree you can do, to be fair. And so I remember more than a lot of the sessions we had, I remember going in and talking to colleagues, other students, particularly after the holidays. So, I'd be working, loading lorries in the holidays because I had to support myself, and I had to work part-time. I was a commuter student, or was now called a commuter student. So I had to do that. So the other students who I knew on a day-to-day basis would come in and they would just talk about just come back from skiing over Christmas, and they'd been to the Caribbean on a cruise, that kind of thing. And I was just sitting there thinking, well, I was loading bloody lorries, So there was a cultural element there as well as a class element. I only went to the library 3 times in 3 years, which again is a deep irony considering how I promote libraries and I'm passionate about libraries. So that entire journey, I liked the learning, I liked some of the sessions, but I never fully engaged. I hadn't been prepared to fully engage. And there was no careers sessions that I remember. I didn't know what the hell to do. I got my degree, and partly I went to university because I didn't want to go into manual labour. So I didn't know what to do as I came out. I worked in advertising, worked in sales, recruitment, that kind of thing. it was only many years later, after spending time in Southeast Asia for about 6 months, where I thought I wanted to become an educator. I wanted to teach. Primary school, there was no way I was doing that. That's hard work. Dealing with a class of 30 young children. No. Secondary, similarly. So I saw an advert for teaching in FE, teaching post-16. It said, you can go work in prisons, work in FE colleges, adult education, and that really grabbed me. So I worked in Lewisham College for 6 years, and Lewisham College is a tough place. I mean, it was an outstanding college in Ofsted terms. It was outstanding in many of the things we did. We had a superb leader, principal there, called Ruth Silver, who was passionate about the potential of FE to change people's lives. And it was infectious. Working in that kind of place, it was just completely infectious. Well, although I'd had some idea of the inequalities within the education system, it wasn't until I started working there that they really became apparent. So inner city college, and the students were just great, but they'd been failed by the compulsory education system. Many of our students had come in, they'd under-attained, they'd had really poor experiences. There were a lot of students who've been excluded or suspended from secondary school, and they came with a lack of engagement or a lack of understanding on how to engage properly with education and what the education system actually could do for them. We had a lot of students who would turn up late for classes because they'd been stopped and searched for the 3rd time that week. We had students who had to work nights in factories, and so they'd come in completely exhausted, but still wanted to learn. They still wanted to transform their lives. We had students who were carers, even young people caring for elderly parents or sick relatives. We had a lot of lone parents. Students who are very similar to the kind of students who come to our university, the BNU, and to other widening participation universities. And these students were bright. They were talented. They had real potential. But most importantly, they saw in education a way to transform their lives and the lives of their families. And they really understood more than I ever did when I was in education, that education is about generational transformation. It's about not just the change that they could make in their lives, but their children's lives and the lives of their grandchildren. These teenagers had much more of an understanding than I did, and they understood inequalities in education far more than I ever did. So that was an education for me in itself. You started seeing how the compulsory education system was so deeply entrenched with inequalities, and then that just played out. I stayed in touch with a lot of them, and they went off to university. And that was instructive in different ways. Some went to high tariff universities, and they experienced an alienation that they just weren't prepared for. College is fantastic for being a really supportive environment. It's a real community, and they go out. They really understand how to support students. And so a lot of these high tariff universities, they weren't prepared for working with students who needed that. They didn't have the kind of support mechanisms that those type of students needed. So a lot of them dropped out. And it was heartbreaking for me because they worked so hard to get there. And when you saw that they were dropping out, as much as I tried to help them and continued to help, so their experience wasn't great there. Some went to teaching intensive universities, post-92 universities. And there was some encountered different types of issues. They encountered academics who had really quite low expectations, and they would blame poor student outcomes on the complexity of their students' lives rather than the university's inability to help those students succeed. And I've worked in 5 different universities, and I've come across these academics who will say, and it's one of the most pernicious phrases I've ever come across, is where our students don't do well because they've got complex lives. I've challenged it every time I've heard it, and always continue, and I really don't want to get to a state where we'd never hear that kind of excuse again. So this was just my experience. It was an experience of seeing how those inequalities play out in the secondary school system, in FE, and also into universities. But it accords with the national picture. This is not an isolated incident. The biggest problem in universities is the myth that education, and higher education in particular, is a true meritocracy. And it's just not. There is no meritocracy in it. Good students will do well. Other students need more support, but we need to get away from that myth. And a cursory glance at the data just disproves it. So if you think about the patterns of access and outcomes in higher education, start with gender. So women historically, and still up to most recent data, are more likely to enter universities. Women are more likely to complete their studies and gain a good degree. So a good degree, but we're thinking a 2, 1 or a first. That's how we're measured in terms of good degrees. Then you start looking at the journey of women past graduation. Men, for example, much more likely to be in highly skilled employment. So, managerial, however it's measured, and it varies. For those graduate professions. And on graduation, men earn around 9% more than women, which is bad enough. But then you look, when you follow that trend over 10 years, 10 years after graduation, men are going to earn on average 31% more than women. So you think about the differences between access and outcomes while in university, but then how they play out, and gender really influences that in the graduate jobs market. Look at ethnicity. So white pupils are more likely to go to higher education, but the highest entry rates as a proportion are pupils from Chinese, Indian and Black African backgrounds. So there's a differential there. Black Caribbean pupils are particularly, they have the lowest entry rates to particularly the higher tariff universities. And so you can see that playing out. And this is why the BAME use that still goes on, it's just not useful. You have to start looking at different groups rather than because the differences between attainment and access for Chinese students and Black Caribbean students, for example, is massively different. Black students are more likely to drop out of higher education, less likely to be awarded a good degree. So again, we're thinking about a 2, 1 or a first. And so this is what's known as the awarding gap. And again, so much work has been done in the sector over the years, yet those gaps still persist. When you look at a sector and in individual universities, even those gaps are still there despite the work that's gone. Then you see how that tracks out again in ethnicity terms into graduate employment. So white graduates still have the highest employment rates of any ethnic group. Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black Caribbean graduates earn the least. And Chinese, Indian and mixed graduates earn the most. So we can see there's a differential pattern between gaining access to university, how they perform at university, but the graduate employment is where it really changes as well. Look at disability. So historically, students with disabilities were more likely to drop out, less likely to get a good degree. But then you can see a change in the data over the last 2 or 3 years. And this is probably the most significant change in the trends of data. So now students who have disabilities are actually no more likely to drop out than students who don't have disabilities. So that is changing. That gap there is definitely changing. What hasn't changed is students who have mental health disability, who have the highest dropout rate of all students. So we've seen in the news, lots of universities are focusing on mental health, and we need to. Universities could double the amount of counsellors they have in mental health support, and it still wouldn't be enough. Particularly after the pandemic, we can see that so many more students are coming forward presenting with mental health needs. And I think that tail is just going to get to increase. We've seen that in schools, and schools have a similar pattern where they're getting more and more students. They're seeing the impact of the pandemic and that lockdown, particularly from students of areas of social deprivation. Look at socioeconomic status. So children who are eligible for free school meals are much less likely to enter higher education, and again, particularly to high tariff universities. They have a much higher dropout rate, and then they're less likely to be in employment or further study. Track that again through to graduate employment. Now, we've looked at it particularly in terms of gender and the differences there, 31%. The children who come from the low areas of higher socioeconomic deprivation earn 10% less. So even those early experiences as a child, if they're, poverty has a long tail, I've argued it for a long time. But you can see how that plays out in graduate earnings. And there's clear links between areas of high deprivation and dropout rates. And students who are from poorer backgrounds are far less likely to get good degrees. I think one of one of those really significant statistics as well. The graduates from the areas of the highest levels of deprivation are 28% less. So again, universities are held to account for the graduate earnings. The amount of our students who go out there and earn above 45 grand is usually pegged at. But you can see the impact of early childhood poverty on graduate outcomes. So while educations can do many things, while FE colleges can do many things in the schools, the impact of childhood poverty is never eliminated. We need to also think about data intersectionally. So white males eligible for preschool meals are less likely than any other intersection to enter university. You'll have seen over the last 15 years or so the emphasis on white working class boys and their achievement in education system. And partly you can think, well, I mean, if you look at the last government, there was a political point to that. You know, there's never been much interest in white working class until it was part of the culture wars, and it was to argue that the white population was getting left behind. So again, you can start to see that playing out in the data. Dropout rates are higher in minority ethnic groups than for white students, and that doesn't change by deprivation area. So if you track that in the data, regardless of levels of poverty, regardless of levels of deprivation, there are higher dropout rates for minority ethnic students than for white students. Males from minority ethnic groups with the same prior attainment also have lower earnings than white males, even after you control for other characteristics. And I love this in the government report under the previous government. They said there were those differences in graduate earnings based on ethnicity were down to unexplained differences. Actually, just an interesting turn of phrase, really, about unexplained differences rather than thinking about what the actual cause might be. So you can see that there are massive differences in the patterns of access and outcomes in higher education. What we also need to bear in mind is the graduate jobs market. We can't underplay the impact and the discrimination that is inherent in the graduate jobs market. When you look, if you're disabled, if you're a mature student, if you're a poor student, if you're female, if you're from a minority ethnic group, you are less likely to get a graduate job. Now, if you look at the way the universities are held to account for that, you've got to ask yourself, well, what can universities do about that? If we have a graduate jobs market that creates these barriers that is inherently discriminatory, we have to think what we can actually do as a university, but we also have to point out that this is not university responsibility solely. We can't change the graduate jobs market, and you have to see that the impact of childhood poverty plays an impact all the way through to after graduation. So we think about the barriers. So there's the prior attainment of students, and if you can track the difference between students who did A levels, for example, and the students who did BTEC, there are differences there. Students who study A levels are encouraged to take A levels, and I think the word encouraged has to be in inverted commas. They're less likely to drop out, they're more likely to get a good job. But we have to think carefully about the attainment and how we take T levels. T levels was a great example. So T levels was an attempt to bring parity between vocational education and academic qualifications. But a lot of universities wouldn't accept T levels. So when they were introduced, they hadn't changed their agreements to allow access. So again, you can see that that's automatically creates barriers towards access, depending on the type of qualifications that the students study. So the prior attainment of students is a key. There's also insufficient advice and support before and during university. So if you think about the traditional engagement of universities in the secondary school system, and we did Zahara Chowdhury organised a great conference here around looking at the transitions between schools and universities, and how, we really discussed how universities can get far more involved. Traditionally, universities will go out and they'll talk to students about how to complete a UCAS form. So they'll, what admissions colleagues look at, how you can shape the narrative. But it has to be more than that. There are very few universities, and we do well here actually, We actually talk about the experience of university. So what it's like when you move from a highly supportive environment to an environment that requires more independence, for example, not just in learning, but in terms of how you access the learning as well. So universities have to do far more. We have to go out there and we have to work with these students about the realities of coming into a lecture theatre, for example. And I distinctly remember the first time I went on a lecture theatre, and it was just a completely different experience. 200 students in there. It was a different type of learning. So we've gone from where you have regular engagement and through our teaching session with the member of staff to a lecture environment. We don't really prepare students. We don't prepare students for how to engage with libraries. We don't prepare students for how to engage with the wider opportunities within universities, that university life, the university experience. So we have to be far more active about how we do that. Then there's the kind of advice and support during university. Now, again, some universities do this really well. Some universities have great guidance. We've got really good student services here who provide support and guidance all the way through. We engage students right from the moment of entry, and we support them all the way through. Other universities don't do that. They prefer their students to navigate pretty much independently. There are the financial concerns. Now, this is a massive barrier. There still isn't great understanding about how students' loans work and student fees. So this week, you'll have seen last week, the government's going to put up fees. Now, that's not going to increase, higher education is still free at the point of entry, same as the NHS is, but it will add to the loan. But when we've been out talking in schools the last week or so and speaking to parents as well, the understanding of how that works, it can be limited. So we have to make sure we're talking to parents as well. Parents will be thinking about university for their children and thinking about, well, go and do a job instead. We've had 15 years of the right-wing press talking about, Mickey Mouse degrees. You still get those stories every day. I saw one at the end of last week. And appraising the value of a university degree purely by what the economic output is at the end. So again, it's wrapped up in the culture, but that understanding of fees and how loans work and the maintenance loans, for example, we have to work with parents as well as the young people who are applying to us for university. Next thing is the cost of living. Now, in universities like ours, we have students who have to work not just part-time. Some of our students are working pretty much full-time now to be able to afford to come to university. So the cost of living crisis is hitting universities like us harder than it is other universities. So we have to be able to work with students to understand that, to budget, to access part-time work, to act as a site with our community to provide these opportunities. If students have to think about whether to eat or pay for the bus fare to come into university, then we have to really take that into account and support them. One of the other barriers around outcomes is, in terms of the university as a sector, is in terms of sexual and racial harassment. We've seen the Office of Students now really put an emphasis on sexual harassment on campus. And again, it's overdue. There are issues because they're large organisations. There's sexual harassment in every large organisation. Universities are no different. So we need to really take a zero tolerance approach to that. And in terms of racial harassment, although interestingly, racial harassment has not had the same emphasis. Mental health issues I've talked about, they are increasing, and universities are struggling to keep up with demand. I'll talk about some of the approach we take here, which is really good. There's a lack of representation in staff in the sector. My favourite, well, actually it's my least favourite statistic about universities. There's about 25,000 professors in UK higher education. There's 160 black professors. Now, I'll go back to the myth of meritocracy, and I was talking about this at a conference yesterday. When you see those stark disparities, those stark inequalities, you have to think, well, universities, they'll talk about being inclusive. How inclusive actually are universities? The statistics speak for themselves. So if we are a truly widening participation university, there has to be a representation. And representation isn't everything, but it's a start. You have to start increasing the representation of your staffing base. And that's at senior levels as well. So I'm not just saying in terms of teaching staff. There are barriers around teaching styles and coursework. If you have an A-level student coming in, particularly after they got rid of coursework, and they'll be very used to exams, for example, and a different type of revision, a different type of learning. And if your curriculum as a university and your assessment methods are called more with that than they do for BTEC, for example, which does rely on projects and coursework, you're automatically creating barriers there. You're automatically doing a disservice to students who come from, who have done BTECs or coursework based, or Access. Access is another really good example. So you have to think about the teaching styles and coursework. It has to be, and I'm not just talking about decolonising the curriculum, it has to be an inclusive curriculum. And finally, I'll come back to this point, which I just can't emphasise enough. There is discrimination in the graduate jobs market. There just is. If you look at graduate schemes of the largest companies, there is a disproportionate amount of white middle-class male students or graduates. There just is. So we have to think about how we navigate them. So we get on to what universities should be doing. We have to start engaging with children and families much earlier. I did some research a few years ago around alternative provision, so pupil referral units, as they used to be called. And these people it was the best examples of family engagement I've ever seen. They didn't just monitor attendance. They didn't, like my daughter's school, if she's late for a registering, I'll get an email. AP work goes far beyond that. They properly understand how to engage with families. And it's not just about in terms of re-engaging the children and getting parents involved in that. It's about getting them involved in the learning experience. So as universities, we have to be, we go out to secondary schools and we talk to 14, 15, 16-year-olds because they're about to come to university. They're the ones we're trying to attract as a university. If we're really going to take widening participation seriously, we have to be out in primary schools. We have to present universities to parents and to really young children as a legitimate destination, particularly in areas where there's a lack of participation in universities. We have to be going out there and saying this is a destination for your child. This isn't just for middle-class children. This is, we really can support and want to encourage all children to engage with universities. But it has to be done sensitively. We have to remember that, particularly in areas of social deprivation, parents probably had a poor experience with the education system, and so there's a reluctance to get involved. Many of them will never have set foot in a university. Many of them have a little understanding of what a university does or is or what it's like, as I did when I was young. So we have to be very proactive about going out into primary schools and secondary, but making sure that there's that continuum. There was a great event here at BNU a couple of months ago that was focused on family learning. And so we invited primary school children in with their parents to come on campus. And for many of them, it was the first time they'd ever stepped foot on a university campus. And you just think we're part of the community. We talk about our civic engagement. We talk about being anchor institutions. Well, we need to prove it. We need to make our campuses permeable. We need to make them welcoming to families and to children so they can see, well, actually, this is a place I want to go to. This is an aspiration. And there's nothing more important than aspiration. We can think about how to collaborate with schools and colleges on raising attainment. Now, this is a bit more difficult. As part of the APP, we're expected to raise attainment. In the past, this has been interpreted as purely an aspiration. So, you're going out and doing talks, subject talks, etc. But we can do more than that as a university. We have access to resource in terms of our research, in terms of our researchers. Over the years, particularly when I was at Leeds Beckett in the School of Education, we created a collaborative research scheme. So we would work with schools, with teachers, not for a fee. We were doing this as part of our civic responsibility. So we're doing collaborative research with teachers about teaching and learning, about how we were training teachers to evaluate their own practice so they could continually improve what they were doing. So it wasn't saying we knew better about how to teach teenagers or to teach young children, but it's about working together so teachers can evaluate themselves and continually improve what they do. So we could do a lot more of that, but when you look at the finances of the sector, this is where we start getting constricted. So while universities would love to go and do that kind of collaborative work, how we fund it is becoming more and more difficult. So I've mentioned previously about preparing school pupils for the realities of university life. So it's got to be more than just filling out the UCAS form. It's about how we can engage our students to go out and speak to about the realities and not sugarcoat it. You know, young people are not stupid. They can handle the reality of the way things are because it helps them to prepare. It helps them to understand how they can adapt to a new environment. And university is a very different environment. So we have to do far more around that. We have to work with families around student finance, around budgeting, as I've said. And then there's the practicalities of what universities do. For those of you who've worked in a university, you will know how timetabling works or doesn't work. It's incredibly complex. It's an art form, part art, part science. But if you look at the way the university timetabling works, students can find themselves with sessions 5 days a week. And some days it might be just for an hour. Other times there might be a huge gap. So they might come in for 9 till 10, for example, and then they've got to wait around for a few hours. In a cost of living crisis, timetabling becomes ever more important. Here we're starting to look about how we can compress timetables into 2 days a week to reduce travel expense and to allow students that time so that they can work to support themselves. But university, we have to take a far more systematic approach to that. We have to think about the lives of our students. We have to think about what their experiences outside of universities like. We have to be the ones to adapt because the sector's always been about how our students adapt to us. Traditionally, historically, that's what universities, that's the approach we've always taken. We have to change now. We have to start adapting to the lives of our students rather than the other way around. If students are choosing between eating and travel to universities, we've got to take that into account. We have to change the way we work. And sometimes it is the practicalities of timetables to reduce those travel expenses. Prioritising student support is obviously really important. We have to think about the financial hardships. So all universities will set aside a certain amount of budget for hardship funds. And again, I've said that in some universities this is being squeezed. The universities are facing their own financial crisis. That is sometimes an easy target to start reducing that. Here we won't do that. Our values are based around supporting students as much as we can, so we maintain those funds. And we even provide free food. We work with the Students' Union. So certain days in the week we provide free meals for our students. And you start thinking, how many other universities are actually doing this? It's more than just the financial access, though. We need to think about the cultural access and participation in universities. So we need, one of the things we do, so we've got, in fact, we do have the best Students' Union in the country. They're always voted #1 or in the top 3, certainly. So we've maintained our fund in the Students' Union, and they provide a scheme called the Big Deal with us. And the Big Deal offers free cultural and sporting opportunities. So our students will go to the theatre, for example, for free. Now, I remember the first time I went to the theatre, bearing in mind I studied English Lit. And I've said this many times, and an English teacher always hate me for it. But the first time I went to see Shakespeare, it's like, what is this? You know, it was the strangest cultural experience because it was so unlike anything I'd ever experienced. You know, the norms of the theatre. And so what we do is we provide free access to this for our students. Our students can go to the theatre, they can go to sporting events. We provide free cookery lessons, free singing lessons, free music lessons. All of these different cultural experiences, because universities are about so much more than just the teaching and the learning. But if we're providing those financial barriers, if students are having to pay for these things, then it's the poorest students that are missing out. We keep going back to the fact that there is inherent discrimination in the graduate jobs market. We have to provide more than just exceptional teaching and learning. There have to be those cultural experiences as well. If you look at the way that the arts is being decimated in this country, and how the people who are most successful in the arts are from the wealthiest families now. You know, the Ray Winstons of the world probably wouldn't make it into acting now, or the Gary Oldmans for that matter. So we have to be providing those cultural experiences. Disability support has to be one of the main priorities, particularly around mental health, but in terms of disability generally. I'm just sounding like I'm plugging B&U all the time, but there is so much good practice there that, you know, continually impresses me. We have a working diagnosis model of support with disabled students here. Now, anyone who's had any experience of CAMS or mental health support, trying to access mental health support for children, knows that the waiting list is immense. It can be 2 years between the point of a child being referred to CAMS for assessment or other disability assessment and actually getting a diagnosis. Now, our students are mainly only here for 3 years, so we have a choice. We can wait for the 2 years and our students don't get any support, or we can provide support based on a working diagnosis. So if our students present and in their presentation say they're disabled, we start providing support from day one. We don't wait for assessment. The assessments will take the time that they take because we have to rely on outside providers often. But we start working with them as though we've already got that statement. The difference that has made is incredible. So whereas traditionally, again, there was an awarding gap for disabled students and non-disabled students, now our disabled students achieve better than our non-disabled students. That's the strength of that model that we've adopted here and my highly skilled colleagues who have taken that forward. Next, we have to, and I'm sounding like a stuck record, I know, that in the inequities of the graduate jobs market, we have to prepare students. Preparing students for a graduate jobs market that is likely to discriminate against them is about more than just writing a good CV. It's about more than an interview technique. We have to make sure our students understand that and how they can navigate those systems and prepare them for the kind of rejections that are more likely to come if you're from a poorer background, for example. So we have to be inclusive about how we approach careers. Now, again, we're doing it well. If universities are measured by high earnings, then against the odds kind of, there's a university like us where half of our students are mature, a large proportion of them from areas of social deprivation, yet our graduates are in the top 10% of earners in the country. And that's against the other 130 universities. So the way we prepare students for that graduate market, we give them detailed advice and detailed guidance about the kind of careers that will support, that will offer them the opportunities they've come here to get. That's what we do really well. We have to increase the representation of staffing, particularly at senior levels. If you look at the vast majority of executive teams in universities, vast majority of them are white, still a higher proportion of males as well. But that is all the way through the hierarchy. So we have to think about how we can recruit our own colleagues inclusively. Here, for example, we've got an inclusive recruitment policy. So that involves, we send out interview questions 72 hours in advance. We insist on mandatory diverse panels. We offer alternatives to the interviews, particularly for neurodivergent applicants. And we've seen that this has worked really well. So we've had a far higher proportion of global majority appointments at senior levels and disabled appointments. So we can see that that's kind of working. And then our students start seeing that there is that greater representation. But it changes the narrative of the university as well. To bring in the more different types of lived experience, you bring in the richer, the kind of work that you can do. One of the things we're currently thinking about at the moment is trauma-informed practice. I've been really impressed. I'm in contact with a lot of secondary school teachers and FE teachers, and schools and colleges are really good at this. and it's not about making teachers and professional service colleagues into therapists. It's about creating the right environment. And I've been really impressed with the work that schools have done around this, or some schools. So it's about how they ensure safe spaces and boundaries for behaviour, how they build trust in relationships between staff and students, between this community of students as well. They take a real community approach. And the training that they do with teachers around understanding the impact of trauma is really impressive. So again, we want to start doing that here as a university, because it's so vital. And if you see the difference this makes from students who have experienced trauma, and again, if you have students from areas of higher deprivation, a lot of them will have experienced trauma. If you come from, poverty, and I speak with lived experience of this myself, that has a long tail. There is trauma. There are things you see that come into education. No expert on it, but I want to become an expert on it, because I think this is the right thing to do for our types of students. So to conclude, widening participation is key. It's something that I'm passionate about, something we're passionate about as a university. But in the university sector, widening participation is too often seen as an activity rather than a defining value. And that's the shift that needs to occur. That's the shift as a sector, where we need to get widening participation as our defining value. And it's what it is for me, and it's what it's like for us as a university. So it defines how we work, it defines how we teach, it defines how we invest, but also how we collaborate. We also need to remember that universities are part of a wider system. When we have a society where the impact of childhood poverty follows that child all the way through their lives into the graduate jobs market, we have to remember the universities is just a small part of that. So we have to remember that, and we have to adapt to that. We also need to be very vocal about the inequities of the society that we work within, and the inequities of the graduate jobs market. So we need to be very vocal, very loud about that, and try and influence change. I'll leave it there. I think there's probably time for questions.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Damien. That was brilliant. I was kind of furiously writing down notes in the chat, chatting to people. There's lots of comments and things as well that I can pick up with you. So yeah, we've got a good amount of time here, so I can just go through and pick up some comments and things that people have been saying in the chat. So let me scroll all the way back. So we had one from Josephine, who was saying that universities can prepare students to become champions of meaningful change. So in teacher education, for instance, universities can equip future educators with the skills and insights necessary to transform educational practices, creating inclusive and supportive school environments that serve all children more effectively. So yeah, there was a little bit of dialogue around that, just in terms of that, that real change of, like I said, hearts and minds when it comes to transforming educational practice. So, going in at the root really as well. So yeah, Josephine's followed up and said, this is about producing ethical research with a real positive impact, and not just perpetuating the reproduction of inequalities.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good point, and I've got a teacher training background myself. When I first came into university, so I was training post-16 teachers. So I was doing observations in prisons, adult education. I saw plumbing lessons one time, and then on the next hour I'm watching a maths lesson. It was an incredible learning opportunity for me. The problem is with teacher training at the moment, and I've been very critical of this in the past, it's so mandated now, in terms of what. If you even look at who was approved, so the government went through, last government went through a market review of teacher education, and some really good universities did not get permission or authority to continue training teachers. It was given to certain multi-academy trusts who, let's say, were more aligned to that government, and it massively reduced. And it also mandated things like the knowledge-rich curriculum, which in essence is great, because teaching and learning is about knowledge. But when you start to see the things that were squeezed out, there's much less autonomy for teachers to adapt their challenge. So I completely agree with Josephine. That's how teaching and training should be, but it's becoming less so.
Okay. Great, thanks, Damien. And then we had one from Jackie, who talks about the looming KEF. And what Jackie mentioned here is that there's a case for universities to replicate the German system. So apparently in Germany, so they kind of, innovation and capacity in Germany is attributed to their industries being embedded in a highly decentralized system of application-orientated universities and research institutions. So that's a really interesting point. So this represents more collaborative, joined up system from in terms of SMEs as well. So having a relationship with their local universities. So here in the UK, widening participation could look at including, reaching out to the business world and receiving them students as employees as well. So more of that connection with businesses. It seems to be much more kind of embedded in the German system.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good model. I completely agree. A lot of businesses, particularly the large, multinationals, have seen themselves as receivers of talent. So universities produce graduates, they take them in, they select very harshly, and then they're almost like receiving a product. The best companies now are working with universities, and they're giving students far more access to them, in terms of mentoring, in terms of internships. Ethical internships, I should emphasize, not the ones where the only people who can get internships are the ones where their parents can afford to support them. Mm-hmm. So internships generally there's a problem with, but when it's done well, it can be transformational. So yeah, Germany has a great system for that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then we also had a question from Aisha. I hope I pronounced that right. She's talked about a zero tolerance and what that might look like, and then kind of zero tolerance around kind of discrimination and inequality in the education system. Then also followed up around the fact that given, discrimination, attainment differentials for students of colour, the cost of living, discrimination in graduate programmes, and also you spoke about obviously graduate careers. What is the pitch to the growing community of people of colour in the UK and beyond kind of enter this system? So I suppose there's maybe 2 points there within that.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt there's a university in the country that says they don't operate zero tolerance. I doubt that it's probably on every single university website. I've been around long enough in the education system, and other people, I know some of the names on here, will know that it's just not the case in a lot of universities. Mm-hmm. There's a big movement away from non-disclosure agreements, because that, in my experience over the last 17 years, is how a lot of these cases are managed. So people leave with a reference. Sometimes I've seen them a few years ago now leave with a payoff, rather than universities taking a properly zero tolerance approach to discrimination, particularly around racism. Mm-hmm. There's a fear in universities that if you're going to actually do it, it's got to be public. Mm-hmm. If you're going to actually take it seriously and you're going to take a stand against racism in particular, then it has to be public. You have to acknowledge it. There was I was reading about that, and I can't remember the name of the company. It was a big corporation in America. It come to me, and there was allegations from 6 women of sexual harassment. And now what would generally happen is it's hushed up, and the people are either kept on and the complainants are exited, or it's just kind of waiting for it until it goes away. And the CEO actually made the decision to publish it. So he went to the newspapers and the press and said, there have been these allegations, this is what I'm going to investigate, and I'll tell you what's happening in 60 days' time. And he did. And he actually published it. He published the results and the exits of various members who were found guilty of sexual harassment. That's the kind of approach I'd like to see. Mm-hmm. If the sector took that approach, then that's how you start getting real change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think on that point, Damien, we've had conversations previously about, and I also liked your point that you mentioned about being vocal. Do you think the sector needs to be more vocal about these issues? A bit of a rhetorical question in there, as you've seen.
Yeah, I shouldn't be, people do say, oh, yeah, you're outspoken. I don't think I'm particularly outspoken. I just think I'm I'm less worried about the consequences, probably. You know, we are a sector that's, look at the discourse around free speech and how that's been weaponized. You know, and universities will trumpet free speech, yet senior leaders are really reluctant to actually talk about the problems. There's no point in pretending the universities everything's rosy and there's no problems, because that's the approach that the sector has taken, you know, in perpetuity, you know, forever. If there are issues, we have to talk about. If there are different ways of doing things, those voices should be heard. If you haven't got an opinion and you're a senior leader in universities, you shouldn't be a senior leader.
Yeah, completely agree. And on that, actually, just one last point, and then we'll wrap up. We've got another one. Let's see how many we get through. So Samantha Heaston. So hi, Samantha. I've not seen you for a while. Nice to see you here. So she says, makes the point, are we in danger of being in an echo chamber? So those of us from such backgrounds are talking to each other about this, but if the rest of our sector isn't listening, you know, seems even more poignant today. So I think that's a good point, actually. So it seems to be always the people who care about these issues are in the room talking. How do you get those people, you know, outside of that in?
Yeah, I tend to agree that there are more echo chambers in universities than most sectors. I've always found, in terms of this and my own learning and development, I think there's very little like social media. You know, for all of its ills, for all of its abuses, I've connected with some amazing people over the years through social media, and who have really changed my thinking. And even last week, I was having a communication with a colleague, never met them before. They saw something I posted, they got in touch, and really changed my thinking. You know, so that's the kind of work you can create. Social media as your own echo chamber, but I follow a really diverse range. I follow everyone from students to other universities, the NHS, all different sectors, because it's just, you have to keep being aware that I could get dragged. Particularly as a senior leader, you know, people don't always want to tell you the truth. They don't always tell you about problems or their true views. I always encourage them to do it, but you still need to make yourself available to a lot of different voices.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Damien. I will wrap up because we're nearly at time, but thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing these insights and also the actionable steps. Like I say, there was a lot in there. I was furiously writing and scribbling away while you were talking. So yeah, it was brilliant. Thank you so much. And hopefully you guys have found it as informative as I have, and have also been able to take some things away. So please expect an email from us tomorrow with the event recording and also details of how to sign up for the roundtable. So I've seen there's a couple of extra comments in there that we're not able to get to, but there are limited places for this roundtable. So please do register if you're interested and want to kind of follow on this conversation. Like I said earlier, we'll also follow up with the Student Outcomes Blueprint resource. And in terms of just a general opportunity for everybody, we have a great newsletter. I'm obviously going to say it's great, but I do believe it is great for educators that do give real practical tools. We have interviews with influential voices across the sector, and we do regular deep dives into these pressing issues on parity in the sector. So I will pop the subscribe link in to the chat for people who want to actually join the newsletter. And yes, I think that's everything for today. I think we're finishing bang on time. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, Damien. And I'll hope to see some of you at the roundtable.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Great to see you.